Welcome, future lawyers, to another BarMax 1L workshop. I'm Celeste Pagano-Bowles. I'm the content director here at BarMax, and I will be leaving most of this to Jen. So I was looking at our topic for today, 1L exam tips, and remembering 1L exams. How about you? We are many, many years past 1L. Are they memorable to you?
Oh my gosh, yes. So I remember my torts exam, which had a loose ferret. And when I got out of my exam, one of my colleagues said, oh my gosh, Jen, what did you do about the parrot? And I was like, oh, Adam, it was a ferret.
And at least you weren't the one calling it a parrot. Anyway.
Right. It worked out fine. We both did fine, but definitely one of those things that you're like, ugh. What happened there, friend?
Well, okay. I was the friend, right? Anyway, I didn't have a parrot, but I remember, mistakes. I remember traumas and studying. I remember walking out of an exam feeling like I didn't know that professor was evil. Like, funny, she doesn't look. Anyway. And we are many, many years past it. We got through it, but you have to get through it before you can look back on it and laugh. So we have people here who are going through it. We feel for you. Even so many years later, we look back, we feel for you. I just want to let people know we have other resources available. We have our 1L product, but also we did a series of workshops this year. If you or friends are interested in any of them, they are on the YouTube page at which is TestMax. TestMax has a YouTube page, and it is in the BarMax 1L workshops playlist. So I put a picture of them. Those are the ones we've done so far, and they've been helpful to a lot of law students. So I wanted to bring that to your attention. And then the other helpful resource that we have is tutoring. Some are like Jen and I are former law professors. Others are just really good teachers who have taught the bar for us, and I feel like have the kind of compassion and ability to help you focus that that our 1Ls need, and law students in general. Often, even for a non-1L class, if we have somebody who is expert enough to tutor it, we will. So reach out to us for that.
So this is about how do you kind of look at what you've done previously and improve. I had a student ask me, what if I'm not a 1L? What if I'm an upper level student? Will this workshop still be helpful? I think so. So, even though we're saying 1L, if you're a 2L or a 3L and you're just like, man, I cannot seem to crack the code of law school exams, this should be helpful. And I will say it does feel like, there's some kind of way that you're supposed to do law school. And until you kind of figure that part out, even though you're smart, even though you know the material, you just aren't conveying it in a way that your professor is going to reward. So today is about how do we help you do that? So let's start with looking at what you did last semester and thinking about, like, did it work or not? So my first semester of law school, I ended up in my study group, and we decided that each of us was going to take a portion of each class and sort of teach it to the others. And that was a lovely substantive review. It did not prepare me for taking the exams, right? So one of the things I want you to do is to, what did we do next semester? We took practice exams together and we talked about them. And certainly if we had an issue, we were like, man, I don't get this, due process thing. Or I don't really get, a gift inter vivos, right? Like, what is that? We would explain it to each other, but we completely changed what we did, right? And I want you to do the same thing. I want you to look at what you did last semester, and you can think about the whole semester. You can also think about reading week. Was it effective? Did it work for you? And not just was it effective, but was it efficient, right? So you're investing your time in whatever this particular type of study is. I want you to think about whether it's worth the time that you're investing. And I want you to think about whether you are kind of working with yourself or you're working against yourself. So one of the things I know about myself is that if you just tell me something, I'm not going to remember it. Like, I just don't get a lot. It's not helpful for me to get information that is just auditory. I really need something that I can look at. And I also tend to like flow charts where I can sort of say, okay, so, the Central Hudson test is first, is the advertisement fraudulent or illegal? And if the answer is yes, that's the end of the inquiry. If the answer is no, you go through the next 3 steps, right? And having that kind of flow chart in my head helps me. So I really want you to kind of look at what you did in your first semester. Did it work, right? And of course, you can think about this semester too. I also want you to feel comfortable personalizing your study to yourself. So when we talk about learning to think like a lawyer, one of the things we mean is we want you to be able to take the strategies that you've learned throughout your law school time into your practice of law, so that hey, I just read this case about equitable adoption, and I need to make a flow chart about how it happens, because that's how I sort of acquire the information that I'm going to need to write this answer. Reply or this motion or whatever it is. So kind of, you're going to hear all kinds of advice. You're going to get advice from me. You're going to get advice from your professors. You're going to get advice from your colleagues. You're going to get advice from your, mother's best friend's cousin who went to law school 30 years ago. Look at that advice and think if it's helpful. You don't have to do everything. You need to do the things that are most efficient for you and give you the greatest return on your investment of time. Think about, kind of after class, what are you doing and is it useful? So most of you probably have a few classes left. I want you to think about kind of, can I take these rules and put them together to come up with a rule, right? That's what you're supposed to be doing in class. You're supposed to be saying, okay, so, this case plus this case leads to this overarching rule, right? And I want you to try to do that after every class section. There was a time when I went to the other professors at the school I was working at, and I said, what do you think is the biggest problem for first year students? Like, what are they struggling with? And synthesis was the thing that they were struggling with. So as you read a case, and usually the first case in a section in your textbook is going to introduce you to the general rule. And then subsequent cases are going to introduce an exception, or they're going to introduce an additional part of the rule, or they're going to explain the minority case, position, right? So think about each case and ask yourself, like, why is this case in my textbook? What am I supposed to be doing with this case that's going to add to, subtract from, change that rule that I read in the previous case? I mentioned I had a study group. I had a really good study group. I loved my study group. We are still in touch. I found it very effective because, like I said, I'm not great at just like listening to a lecture and retaining that information. So having people that I could talk to was super helpful for me. I really liked having a study group that was not people just like me, right? So I went to law school. I was a single mom, and I was there to do the work and get home. There was a guy in our study group who was straight from undergrad to law school. This was what he had always wanted to do. There was a guy who had been a missionary for a while. There was a guy who had worked in the Army. And I secretly think he was probably like an intelligence gathering officer, although he never confirmed that. So we came from different politics, different ages, different experiences. And one of the things that allowed us to do was to look at this material from multiple angles. And that meant we could make counter arguments, right? I knew that the counter argument to, why, the seizure of goods by the sheriff could be potentially illegal, right? I knew what the counter argument to that was. things we learned over time. And I found out later when I started to do this work, this is actually backed up by data. This is actually, when we look at what makes a study group effective, these 3 things are what makes it effective. So the first thing is you want to have an agenda. What's the reason that you're meeting? A lot of study groups will just be like, hey, we're going to meet every Friday. Great. What are you doing on that, right? Because otherwise what happens is you get in there and it's like, well, what are you planning on doing this weekend? Oh, I'm going to study. Oh, I need to go, to the mall and get my dress for barristers or whatever, right? If you have an objective, if you have an agenda, we're going to review this last section in crim, and we're going to look at a practice question. That is going to allow you to use that time effectively. And because the agenda is stated and shared, hopefully everybody's on the same page. And if somebody goes on a tangent, you can say, want to talk about that, maybe not do it during our study group time. You want to emphasize the importance of being prepared, right? Of showing up prepared. And you want to have a beginning and end time, right? So there's sort of this rule that's, it's not really a rule, but it's kind of a rule, which is that anything you're trying to do will expand to take the amount of time you have available to it. So if you just say you're going to meet on Friday, you're going to okay, so is that 4 hours? You can spend 4 hours on a particular question, or is it 2 hours? Is it 4 hours, but 3 questions, right? So kind of knowing how much time you have and what you're going to do is going to allow you to use that study group most effectively. And what are things you could do in a study group? So, there's the obvious of, hey, let's talk about this concept we covered in crim. I don't get it. Did you guys get it? What did you say, right? There's also the, hey, the prof was talking about procedural due process, and I just honestly tuned out for probably 15 minutes. Anybody else catch what happened there? Okay, you can fill in those note holes. And the most important thing is going to be doing those practice questions. Because that can be, okay, let's look at this question. Let's read it aloud. Let's discuss. It can be, let's look at this question. Each of us individually outline it, and then we discuss. It can be, let's look at this practice question, everybody write it, and then, trade with your neighbors so that you can get some feedback, right? So if you have a study group and you want to use it more effectively, here's how. But remember I said there's no silver bullet, right? There's no thing this is the thing you have to do. And so sometimes people will say study group, study group, study group. But if you're not a group learner, it's okay to say, I'm not getting what I need to out of this group for it to be worth the investment of time, right? You're not married to these people. It's okay to take a break if you need to. As I said, I want you to think about this as synthesis, right? And you don't want to have what I would call the briefo line, where it's, the person, it's like everything that you learned about a particular case. Instead, I want you to think about having, the overarching rule, and then any particular exceptions or, elements to that rule, and cases that establish those elements or exceptions, right? One thing that you can do is to use our outlines. If you decide to go with the BarMax and you purchase it, right, you can use those as a template. They may allow you to have a structured organization. You also could use other commercial outlines. You could use your friends' outlines, but think about, you want to make sure that you take that outline and you personalize it to your professor, right? I was talking with this student the other day who said, oh, my professor talks a lot about the purpose of contracts. Fabulous. That needs to be in your outline, right? So think about it's not an outline of, torts. It's an outline of Professor Carr on torts or whatever it's going to be. I also want you to think about boiling your outline down into either kind of these if-then flow charts, right? So if the contract is goods, then UCC. If it's not goods, common law. sometimes you'll hear these called attack outlines. We have some as well, which again, you can use those. You can use those as a template to build your own. But ideally, you're going to have this. And let's be honest, this is the real world. It's not, my ideal world. So if you don't have your outline yet, that's okay. But maybe take some time and start working on it so that when you get to reading week, you can do practice exams. I'm so sorry, guys. I don't know why I'm like needing to drink today. Water. I'm drinking water. So let's say that you came to me and you said, Jen, I have no time. I'm a part-time student. I have kids. I don't have time. What's the one thing that I can do to do better in school? I would say practice exams. Okay. And here's the thing. The more you do, the better. And one of the things you want to remember is there's only so many ways to test these concepts, right? If I want to test felony murder, I'm going to have to give you a scenario where somebody commits a felony and someone dies. That's the only way to test that. Once you've seen it a couple times, you can kind of pre-plan how you want to respond. I am going to suggest that you look at what you wrote last semester, get your answers and kind of just look at what happened. What did you do well? What did you do that you'd like to improve on? Most professors will kind of meet with you and be willing to discuss the answers with you and how you did, particularly if you make it clear it's about improving your writing, not about arguing about your grade. And ideally, I don't, last semester is last semester. I don't really care about, you didn't, understand the, products liability, state of the art rule. I don't care, right? What I do care is if you're getting consistent feedback from your professors that, hey, it seems like you understand the material, but you're not, giving me good analysis. If you're getting consistent feedback like I did, that, hey, you're being kind of conclusory. If you're getting consistent feedback that, hey, you seem to know the overarching rule, but you never mentioned the exception, that's something we can change, right, going forward. So that's what you're really looking for is there something that I'm doing consistently that I need to alter or fix, right? It's happening in many classes. There's something about my exam writing across the board that I want to address. I want you to practice. I want you to write those questions. And I want you to think about like, okay, what do I do with these questions, right? Like how do I want to structure my answer? Where are you going to get these practice questions? Hopefully your professor has a stack of previous questions that you can use. But even if they don't, again, there's only so many ways to test this stuff, right? If I'm writing a negligence question, someone is going to have to do something that's kind of dumb that results in somebody else getting hurt, right? So there's only so many ways to test it. So definitely think about, where can you get those questions? We have some. So we have questions if you decide to go either for the 1L package or the BAR package, there's questions in there. We've also got flashcards. You can even just Google, questions on, sorry, I've got some foster kittens and they are getting into things. So my foster kitten wrangler is grabbing them so that they're not distracting. You can use those questions, even if you just Google them, right? Use another professor's questions. One thing I do want you to do, if at all possible, is to take a look at whatever your professor has posted as, sort of the model answer or the example answer. And I want you to think about what does it seem like this professor is rewarding? So you're going to look at how that answer is organized. You're going to look at those rule statements and maybe you're going to lift them and memorize them. You're going to look at, does it seem like your professor rewards answers that have a policy-based reasoning in them, right? And so it's not just looking at it and thinking about like what issues are in there. It's really dissecting that answer to see, what it is that your professor seems to value. And hey, by the way, when your prof is going over a hypo in class, and then she kind of walks you through how she would address that hypo, that's an example of what she wants from you on the exam. All right. So like we said, I want you to really use those model answers effectively, right? Students tend to kind of say like, oh, well, we both discussed negligence and we talked about duty and breach and damages. And so, I would have done great just like this person did. I mean, maybe, right? And I do want you to see if you talked about everything that professor seems to want, but also think about like organization, right? Let's say you're in contracts and you start with, is it UCC or common law? And then the model answer says, are they merchants or not? Maybe that's an organizational strategy that you want to adopt rather than waiting until, whether they're merchants or not becomes relevant. Maybe they start with solicitation, conspiracy, accomplice liability. Okay, maybe that's something you want to lift. Obviously, the professor liked those rule statements. Go ahead and grab them. Now, I do want you to be careful because sometimes, like, especially if it's a student answer, the prof is going to be like, yeah, the majority of this answer was great, but, there's one rule in here that's incorrect. In which case, I do want you to, double check those rules statements for accuracy. But otherwise, hey, the professor seems to like it. Look at, are they incorporating cases? Are they saying, daily, the kid kicked the other kid and, didn't have intent to harm him, but still had the intent to do the wrongful act? Are they incorporating policy? Are they saying, hey, the purpose of contracts is, either to ensure that people keep their promises, or it's to ensure that people can order their lives in the most economically beneficial way possible, right? Look at that. Are they giving firm conclusions? Are they saying it's certain that the seller will be successful because of this reason? Or are they saying something like, it's probable that the seller will be successful so long as she can establish that, whatever, there was a writing sufficient to demonstrate, an intent to agree, right? So really dissect those model answers. Don't, kind of look at them and get intimidated and say, oh, well, I could never write that. You really pull them apart and like, hey, what's in there that's good? What could you copy? All right, let's talk about time management. So I'm going to say that, there's elements of this, like, just, hey, what time do you have available? Right. As I mentioned, I was a full-time student. I was a single mom. I had a 3-year-old when I started law school, and I really sort of said, I am going to be available for my son from when I pick him up at 5 p.m. until he goes to bed at 8:30 or 9. Then I'm going to study for a little bit. And Saturdays, we're going to go to the park where he can play and I can study. And then, I'm going to go to school every day, 9 to 5, treat it like a job. And that was the time that I had available. That was the time I dedicated to studying. That's what I could do. Right. So there's that part of it. There's also, though, like, are there classes where you're like, look, I feel like I can get an A in this class and I really want to focus some effort on that. Or this particular professor, I just love her. I want to, do as well as I can. Are there classes where you're like, dude, I just need to pass? I'm in California. I can say, dude, I can call everybody dude. It's just like, I just need to get through this, right? Like, I don't care. Like, I just need to pass. That is a perfectly acceptable goal. I have definitely talked to students who said, my dad's a lawyer. He's already promised me a job in his firm. I just need to pass. That is okay. Let's set that goal and let's try to meet it, right? So what are you going to do? The first thing I'm going to say is it's really not effective usually to say that you want to get a particular letter grade, right? That's not necessarily achievable, right? But maybe you can say, I want to adapt my writing style to include more policy, or I want to make sure that I've done at least 5 practice questions before I sit for the exam, or whatever. And then I want you to think about, okay, if I want to adopt more counter arguments, how do I achieve that goal? Well, maybe it's as I read each case, I'm going to, ask what did the plaintiff say versus what the defendant said. Maybe it is as I review model answers, I'm going to look at how they incorporated counter arguments. Maybe it is reviewing answers with a friend so that you can see what the counter arguments might be, right? So think about not just your goal, but how can you break that down into smaller, more manageable steps, right? It's kind of like, I always tell folks, if you set the goal of like, today I'm going to study torts, what even does that mean, right? You're going to open up your BarMax torts outline, and you're going to think to yourself, well, I need a cup of coffee. And then you're going to go get a cup of coffee. And then you're going to realize like, you kind of need to do the dishes. And then you're going to realize that like, hey, as you're putting the dishes away, like I also kind of need to go grocery shopping. And then you're going to come back and study torts for a few minutes. Hey, I studied torts. I can check it off my to-do list. But if you say to yourself, like, I want to get through at least the intentional torts, and I want to make sure I have memorized those 7 intentional torts, that is an achievable goal, right? And you're going to know whether or not you did that thing. So big goal breaks down into smaller, more manageable goals. All right. We've kind of already talked about this, but as you think about your time, I want you to think about, okay, how does your reading week break up? So many law schools are going to say, hey, you basically have an exam every 3 days for the reading week, right? So maybe it's like, hey, day 1 is making sure my rules look good. Day 2 is doing practice exams, and day 3 is filling in any gaps, right? Day 3 is like, okay, I've got to make sure I have an organization down, and I want to do another practice exam on products liability because I'm not sure I really understood that, right? But kind of think about that. How does that look? Or maybe you have a class that you already are doing super well in, and so you're like, look, that's going to be 2 days, and then I'm going to take that 3rd day and dedicate it to a class that I'm not doing as well in. And hey, by the way, for those of you who are thinking, I need to improve my GPA, don't forget that there are some courses that are weighted more heavily than others. So if you're taking a 4-credit class, you may want to spend a little bit more time on that than the 2-credit class, because it's going to count more for your GPA. All right, Jen, this is all great. I appreciate that. But how do I write better? That's what this is supposed to be about, right? It's not supposed to be just about how do I prepare for exams. It's also supposed to be how do I write for them? Well, don't worry, young friend, we are getting there. So the first thing I want to talk about is some examples of problems that professors, if you go and talk to them, they'll say, this is the thing that people struggle with. I'm going to start with being conclusory because this was definitely my first problem when I was my problem when writing exams my first semester. There we go. So I would kind of give the rule. I would say, here's what assault is. And then I would give a fact. And then I would say, okay, so it's done. He's liable. That's not analysis. That's conclusory. That's being conclusory, right? So what do you want to do? You want to give your rule. Assault is the intentional causing of apprehension of imminent harmful or offensive contact. And then you're going to say, here, fact, Jack swung at Mary. And what does that show? That he intended to cause her to fear harmful contact. And what particular fact shows harmful contact? A punch. Then you can give the conclusion. He intended to cause Mary fear when he swung at her. The one thing that really helped me with this when I was a 1L, was I had that 3-year-old at home. What's a 3-year-old's favorite word? Why, right? Hey, you got to go to bed. Why? Because you're tired. Why? Because you've been running around all day. Why? Because that's what 3-year-olds do. I don't know, go to bed, right? I want you to get to that point, that go to bed point with your exam, right? So you're going to say, this was an assault. Why? Well, here's what an assault is. Okay, so here are the facts. Here's what happened that establishes that these things happened, right? So don't be afraid to ask yourself why as you're answering those exam questions. Sometimes you get folks who they talk around the topic, right? So it'll be something like, well, a battery is like when the one person, causes a contact with the other person, and the contact could be offensive, like, it bothers their dignity, but also it could be harmful. oh my gosh, right? Or they give what's a tautology, right? And I grabbed this quote from one of my son's books when he was little. Some things, I think, don't float because they sink. And you're thinking to yourself, okay, Jen, it has because. You said I had to use because. That doesn't explain anything, right? Give me that clear rule. Some things don't float because they are more dense than the substance upon which they are resting, right? Walk in with those memorized, right? And what I always tell folks to aim for, clear, concise, complete. That's what I want from your rule, that it's clear, concise, and complete. And hopefully it's memorized, right? So that you can get in there and just spit it out. That's going to save you time. It's also going to help you make sure that you don't forget any elements. So really think about, having a clear definition of what you're talking about. So we always talk about having a rule. If it's helpful, imagine that this is a definition of this term. Okay, sometimes you get folks who kind of just come into the exam and they kind of give a what I would call a word vomit, right? Or it's spaghetti, and you expect the professor to sort through it and find the answer. Rather, I would prefer that you go into that exam with a plan about how you're going to organize it, right? And again, there's only so many ways to ask these questions. So if you looked at a couple of practice questions, you can really come out with an effective organizational strategy. And if you're struggling with, your organizational strategy, think about, you want to begin at the beginning. So, hey, Congress can regulate this area because of Commerce Clause. And then you introduce the exception. This regulation could be infringing on a fundamental right. And what happens if it's a fundamental right? It's going to subject it to strict scrutiny. So you want to walk in with your outline, right? So if you think about contracts, you're probably going to start with, is this a good or a non-good, right? Is it going to go for UCC or is it going to go for common law? And depending on what happens in there, you may have a plan B, which is, let me talk about the purpose of the action. Otherwise, you might skip that and go directly to, the goods part of contracts, right? So really walk in with a plan about how you're going to attack that problem. I want you to make sure that you're really thinking about both sides of the problem, right? Make sure that you're incorporating any particular counter arguments. Even if you think that argument is going to fail, I want you to explain to me why it's going to fail, right? I looked at a question the other day with a student that had, I kind of looked at it and I was like, well, everything the state is doing is permissible under the Constitution. So, and I had this moment of what is the professor hoping for here? And then I realized the professor just wants you to say, hey, they might argue this, but it's going to fail because this reason. So make sure that you're thinking about both sides. By the way, in that example where it says clearly, anytime you're telling me that something is clear or obvious or, definite, you may be being conclusory, you may have overlooked something. So I really want you to be careful with those words and with the instinct to use those words. Okay. Sometimes somebody gives it's a whole, it's more than a brief line even. It's like let me just regurgitate everything I learned in this class, right? No. I want you to answer the question that's asked. If I come to you and I say, hey, where's the closest Starbucks? And you're like, well, there's one that's 5 miles away. There's one that's, 2 miles away, but it's closed right now. Great. You know a lot about Starbucks, but do you know where the one is that's closest to me? So imagine that this person, is giving everything that they learned about in this semester. It doesn't show your professor that you understand what's being tested in this issue, and it doesn't tell your professor that you know what this is about. And we talked about mistakes that we've made on exams. I will tell you, I did this in my third year, right? My last semester. I don't know what I was thinking, but I got into talking about why one particular thing was not in that part of Crim Pro. It was in another part of Crim Pro. I don't know what I was thinking, man. And I ran out of time to talk about what it actually was. So make sure you're being selective about what you're discussing and that you're identifying what you're being asked. Sometimes there's sort of this intermediate step, right? So you get told you're too conclusory and you should use the facts. And then what ends up happening is you give me a book report. So this is what happened. Jack balled up his fist, cocked his arm, aimed it at Mary, and swung at her. That's true. That was all in the facts. That did happen. What does it show? Why does it matter? What is the purpose of those facts? What is it there to do? So really think about, if you're going to give me the facts, tell me why they matter. I used to ask that a lot. I used to say, why do I care? Why do I care that he swung up his fist? Why do I care that he aimed at Mary, right? And I had a student who made me a lovely sign, hand-painted wood, flowers and fake pearls. It was beautiful. And then it was written in the middle, why do I care? And I was like, oh, that sounds a lot harsher than I mean it to when I see it written on this little sign. But it's a good way to think about, your use of the facts. This person is almost all the way there. They know what the key facts are. They know the law. They just need to connect them, right? Okay, Jen, that's great. You told us what not to do. Let's talk about what to do. And of course, we always talk about IRAC. For me as a 1L, I was like, that's great. What exactly do you mean by issue? What exactly do you mean by rule? So I'm going to try to break it down. You're going to have some professors who are going to want a very specific issue. If you have that kind of, and how are you going to know? You're going to look at their old exams, right? What is it that they're rewarding? If you have a professor like that, or if you find this structure helpful for you in terms of sort of, ordering your own analysis, saying something like whether, intent is satisfied when he aimed at Mary, right? So whether this element is met when these facts. Other professors don't really care so much about a specific issue statement. They're fine if you just say this is battery, right? Or battery's, dash intent. So really look at those exams and kind of think about how they want the issue identified. And where I see folks tend to go wrong with this is either they have a very general issue statement. So the issue is whether there was adverse possession. Fine. But then I want a sub issue that says, whether the entry onto the land when he believed he owned it satisfies the adverse element, right? So give me the identification of what is being asked by these facts. Okay, so the rules. So again, I don't necessarily want everything you know about torts, right? You don't need to start with, hey, there's 7 intentional torts and, there's battery, assault, false imprisonment, IIED, trespass to land, trespass to chattels, conversion. I don't need all that, right? But I do want you to start with, assault is, and you give me your rule for assault. And then I want you to think about each element of this rule. So remember, as you're going through class, you're reading cases, and case number 1 probably gives you the rule for what an assault is. And case number 2 may give you the rule for what, intent is, or what imminent means. You're going to grab the rules from those. And what you're really doing here is you're creating kind of an IRAC city. That's a joke. IRAC, big conclusion structure, where you're saying, hey, the issue is assault. The rule is assault is the intentional causing of imminent apprehension of harmful or offensive contact. And then you're saying intent means intent to do the wrongful act. Here, Jack had intent because he took aim at Mary before he hit her. Therefore, intent is satisfied. Harmful or offensive contact means that it's painful or damaging to the body or injurious to the dignity of the reasonable person. Here, a punch is, painful or damaging to the body, and therefore this element is met. and you're kind of concluding about each little piece. You're giving a little rule for it. You're concluding about it. And then at the end, you're going to say, therefore, because Jack had intent and the punch was harmful or offensive contact and Mary saw it coming, so she had apprehension, this was an assault. So kind of thinking about it as IRAC-Rack. Some of this stuff is super clear, so you may not need a full, mini rack on it. It would be okay to just say harmful contact, parenthesis, punch. Nobody's going to argue that a punch is not harmful contact. But it's good to practice this way, especially in the beginning, as you kind of think about, how do I want to structure my analysis? All right. So let's say that you're me and your professors have told you are good at the rules, Jen, but what about your analysis? How are you going to fix it? And guys, if you walk away from this and you were like, that was a lot of information, this is the thing to remember, okay? I want you to have the words because or shows. And ideally, every sentence after your rule has one of these words, right? So, this was a harmful or offensive contact because a punch is painful or damaging to the body. The fact that he looked at her and took aim shows intent, right? So think about that structure. If you say like, hey, this was an assault, I want you to imagine that, your 3-year-old is there saying, okay, but why was this an assault? Well, because here's the rule for assault. I've also heard like, imagine explaining this to your grandma, or imagine explaining it to a client who's like smart, but doesn't know anything about the law. Sometimes students will say, but Jen, I know the professor already knows the law. That's true, but they don't know that you do. So you want to say like, here's the rule and here's how it applies using some of these words. What else can you do to improve your analysis? I love what I call the while sentence. If you don't like while, you can use however or alternatively or something like that. Let's say that you have a quick, easy argument, right? While Jack will argue that because he was aiming at Mary and accidentally hit Bob, he did not have intent. But this argument will fail because transferred intent, right? While the buyer will argue that the common law should apply because the greatest price of the contract was related to goods, the UCC will apply. So if it's a quick, simple counter argument, you can just do that. Let's say that it's a little bit longer. You can say, the prosecution will argue that because this was at dusk, the night element is satisfied. However, the defense will argue that traditionally it had to be within 30 minutes of sunset. And here, dusk was not, whatever. Think about using every single fact. You could actually just take your pen and put a line through each fact as you use it. And when you get done, you want to have found a home for every fact, right? Sometimes there are irrelevant facts, but you can always say the fact that the witness gave the plaintiff a box of peaches 3 years ago is irrelevant because it doesn't impact her ability to observe the accident, right? And I want you to use the language of the rule. So if you think about syllogisms, right? So what the heck is a syllogism, Jen? It's been a while. So syllogism is, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. So if I change the language, it doesn't work. All men are mortal. Socrates is a dude. Therefore, he's going to die. It means the same thing, but it loses its logical power because it doesn't use that same language, right? So if you tell me that in order for contact to be considered harmful, it has to be painful or damaging to the body, and then you tell me here the punch was hurtful, is that the same thing? And it sounds dumb, I know, but it's one of the things that we do as lawyers. We say, hey, this particular word has a specific meaning. So switching them up diminishes the power of your analysis. You're going to feel like you're the worst writer ever because you're saying these little racks, and in each one you're like, hey, while this could happen, this other argument is better. While this could happen, this other argument is better. Or, the one side will argue this, the other side will argue that. This is not writing, guys. I know we call it writing, but it's not writing. It's much more like math. You can use the same because of the wonderful whiz he was. You can use that over and over again. Your professor is not going to object to it. Just like if you were doing a math proof and you used, the addition sign, your prof's not going to expect you to change that to the multiplication sign because you've used addition sign a lot, right? So think about it as being more like math than writing. And I want you to, I know the voice of your third grade, teacher is going to be echoing in your head about vary your language, keep your reader's attention. No, use the same language. Show me how, this particular fact is the satisfaction of this rule definition that you just gave me. I do want you to call a winner. Sometimes it's not clear what the so-called right answer is, right? Sometimes sometimes it is clear, right? Like a punch is harmful or offensive, done. But sometimes it's not so clear. It's like, well, does, taking your tips home from your job get merchant's privilege if you're not supposed to do that? Like, I don't know, right? And you're just gonna, go ahead and give a conclusion, right? The best example I can come up with, most of us, know somebody who's been divorced or we've been divorced ourselves. And, maybe you think about like the child custody. Both parents are active and involved. Both parents care about the kid. Ultimately, the judge just has to make a call. Same thing for you, right? I don't want you to get hung up on whether or not this is, the best answer. Just tell me, what you think is going to happen. And let's say that you're like, well, I'm not sure what's going to happen unless, because I don't know about this particular fact. You can say that. You can say, the seller will likely be able to sue successfully if he can establish there was a writing sufficient to demonstrate contractual intent, right? So it's okay to say likely, probably, and throw in an if. Okay. When you conclude, I want you to think about what the tiebreaker is. And this is one of the things that, if you were an A- student last semester and you're here because you want to get to an A, this is the thing I want you to do, okay? Think about what are the policies behind this? You can say, hey, here the seller is likely to be successful because one of the purposes of contract law is to allow folks to organize their, lives in the way that is most economically beneficial, or whatever your professor has said is the policy of whatever class you're in. Think about old cases. Here, it appears that this would be offensive because it's like the case where the woman came in and the gentleman said, if you let me love and touch you, I will fix your clock, right? And hey, by the way, if you don't remember the name of the case, you can always summarize the facts like that. What are, the facts that are likely to cause to break the tie, right? Here, because the burglary happened at midnight, it's likely that the state will be able to establish a burglary, whatever it is. How are you going to know what tiebreaker you're going to use? You're going to look at your professor's old exams. What are other students using who were successful? And you're going to watch how she walks through hypos in class. And what does she talk about a lot? This is just like if you had an argument in front of a judge and you went to look at and listen to that judge and say, okay, what does this judge seem to find persuasive? You're going to do the same thing. You're going to say like, hey, every day in class, we talk about the development of the Equal Protection Clause. So you're going to say like, here, it's likely that he will be successful in his equal protection claim because the 14th Amendment was designed to, prevent discrimination against blah, 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 right? And you're going to use those clues as a way to incorporate your an analysis into your conclusion. Okay, I want to pause here just for a second. And I will say one thing that I want you to think about is the use of white space, bolding, underlining, italicizing. The more that you can do that, the easier it's going to be for your professor. You want to remember that she has, 60 of these to grade. So, if you can make it easy for her, that's going to be that's a happy professor is a happy grader, right? You also want to imagine that she probably has a rubric, meaning she has kind of a list of things she's looking for you to discuss. And so the easier you make it for her to find that, the better off you're going to be. Sometimes I tell folks, I want you to imagine me, right? I'm the one who's grading your exam. And, I've got a foster kitten climbing over me. The kids are like, Mom, what's for dinner? Somebody wants to watch, baseball on TV and they can't, get it set to the right channel. Give me like white space, give me headings, give me, and the headings can just be your issue statement, right? And you can just do an enter after you reach your conclusion. Those kinds of things can really orient me to where we are in the problem. Okay. Having said that, I've mentioned a couple times that I'm a mom. I'm going to give you the mom speech. Okay. Number one, make sure you're getting enough sleep. What we tend to do when we get stressed, when we have a lot to do, is we sleep less, right? Oh, I'm sure I can understand this concept if I just, keep at this for another 3 hours. And then we go to bed for, 4 hours instead of, our usual 8. Couple of problems with that. One, sleep is essential to learning. So sleep is when your brain sorts everything you've seen or thought about during the day into what is relevant and should be retained and what is irrelevant and can be forgotten. So not sleeping diminishes your ability to retain what you're learning. It's also going to help with stress and anxiety, right? Sleep is super important for stress and anxiety. So I want you to make sure that you're getting enough sleep. Okay. I also want you to have frequent breaks. Okay. Most people can pay attention to something for about 75 to 90 minutes, which is why that's the typical class length, right? Some even would say 50 minutes. Take a break. It doesn't have to be a big break. Check your Facebook really quick. I'm told nobody has Facebook anymore, that it's just like, middle-aged ladies like me, but whatever it is you check, TikTok, watch a 20-minute episode of your favorite show. Plan to have dinner with your family once a week. Attend to the things that make you happy, right? Those things are also important. I want you to think about nourishing your brain and your body. So what are the things that, keep you healthy and strong? I don't want you to get the flu, right? That's going to throw your whole plan off because you're going to end up with the flu. I also want you to make time for exercise. So again, super helpful with stress. But there are also studies that show people who exercise regularly retain more information. So again, if you want to study, make sure that you're getting that exercise. So if we think about, the return on investment, that's something that's really important. I do want to mention again, let's say that you're like, Jen, I hear what you're saying about looking at my professor's model answers. I need help doing that the first time. Or I'm really trying to incorporate the becauses and the shows and the while sentences. Can you look at this and help me figure out if I'm doing it right? Yes. So you can go ahead and just buy, a couple of tutoring hours. You can buy a bunch of tutoring hours. And I'm also happy to sit down and say like, hey, I think you're struggling with this concept. Let's discuss it. Or I don't think this organization is working for you. Let's fix it. I'm going to go back to what I think is one of the more important slides, but I will give you a quick little, feel free to drop questions if you have them. If you don't, that's okay too. I will say, if there were 3 things that I wanted you to take away from this session. Okay. So here we have someone who says they're from Argentina and she's starting law school this fall. Do I have any recommendations? So the oftentimes your school will send out a reading list. If they do, definitely take a look at those books. There's several books on the market that will help you prepare for the bar exam, for law school rather. Those can be super helpful. I would say it can be helpful to take a look at, outlines from particular subjects, right? So you kind of get a sense of where you're supposed to be going. Law school tends to be here, read these 3 cases, figure out what the rule is, come back to class prepared to talk about what that rule is, and then we're going to test you on your application of the rule. So, especially in the first weeks, as you are um, reading cases and you're like, what the heck am I supposed to be getting out of these? Having access to a commercially prepared outline can be really helpful, right? So if you know that what you're supposed to be getting out of, the I'll fix your clock if you let me love and pet you case is that, hey, offensive language can qualify as an assault, or it has to appear imminent that the harmful contact will occur. Then it's easier to kind of figure out how those things fit together. So definitely take advantage of any reading list that your school sends out. Maybe take a look at some commercial outlines. Some international students will find that they're struggling with the language. And let's just be honest, some of this language is super antiquated and it's kind of like its own game. It's like, oh, the writ of replevin. And you're like, what the heck is a writ of replevin? So one thing that is sometimes suggested for international students is to focus on improving your reading. So one, The Economist is a magazine that is written at about probably one of the highest reading levels on the market today. So that's one you could take a look at. It's also cool because sometimes it has some international stuff in it. I would also say, make sure you have a good legal dictionary. I think some are online now, but you can also just get a legal dictionary. However, particularly for 1Ls, you're going to get this advice of like, look everything up you don't understand. That's not really how we acquire language, right? The way that we acquire language is we hear a word used, we kind of make a guess about what it means, and then we test that guess. So where I'm from, a sandwich that comes on a long roll is called a sub sandwich, right? In other places, it could be called a grinder sandwich. So if I go to the East Coast, Pennsylvania, and somebody offers me a grinder sandwich, I might be like, well, what the heck is a grinder sandwich? Okay, I think it's something like a sub sandwich. And then I test that hypothesis. And that's how I learned that new word. So I would encourage you to do that. So you read your case and they're talking about the writ of replevin and you're like, what the heck is the writ of replevin? And you make a guess that it's some kind of document from the court that allows the plaintiff to go get their property back. You read the case, you see if that seems to be true. And then if you still have questions, you look it up. But think about acquiring that language in a more natural way. So those would probably be my suggestions for anybody who's starting in the fall. I will just give you a quick, what 3 things would I want to take away if I was you? So number 1 is going to be the because and the shows. And I really want you, every sentence after your rule should have a because or shows. So, if you say burglary is the breaking and entering the dwelling place of another at night with intent to commit a felony therein, that's your big rule. And remember, you're going to do rack. So then you're going to say at night means, under the cover of darkness. Now it's time to do some analysis. Every sentence should have a because or shows. Because the defendants, headed over to the house at 11 p.m., it was at night, that kind of thing. So number 1, think about the because or the shows. Make sure you're including those. Number 2, don't be afraid to personalize your prep to what is useful for you. There's no magic bullet. There's no specific thing you have to do in order to be successful. It's about, how do you personalize this? How do you make it useful for you? Don't be afraid to stop doing things that aren't effective and integrate things that are effective. Number 3, practice exams, right? That is going to be the single most effective thing you can do to prepare for your exam. It's going to tell you what this professor values. Does she have a fundamental rights question every year? Okay, you should be prepared for a fundamental rights question. It's going to help you see how these issues come up because there's really only so many ways to test them. It's going to help you plan your organization. It's going to help you understand whether or not you actually know the material, right? A lot of us, we're going to read the question and then we'll read the model answer and we'll say, oh yeah, I totally would have said that. Try writing it out. See if you actually totally would have said that. So I'll give you those 3 takeaways. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. I wish you all the best of luck. I promise that even though you're going to remember this stuff 20 5, 20-ish, however many years it was later, you are going to look back on it and laugh. So I know it's stressful now. I also know you can be successful, and I wish you all the best.